Back to Normality, Chapter 42 to 46. I awoke in Laenor's arms with my face pressed against his naked chest. It was so nice just to be held, and against Laenor to boot, that I managed to stop myself shuddering in revulsion at how gross I felt. Sweaty and unpleasantly sticky. By gods, I want to boil my own skin off now. Laenor stirred as I started trying to wiggle out of his grip, pulling himself upright and groaning at the morning light. Then he glanced towards me with a look of wonder on his face that really was not warranted. He laid a warm hand over my stomach with a kind of reverence that made me want to slap him or embrace him. "Do you think you might be pregnant already?" he asked quietly. I doubted it, but I didn't want to demoralize him, so instead I managed a small smile and laid my own hand over his. "I hope so, but we must keep trying until it is confirmed." He beamed at me. "What a fine thing, to be a father," he marveled, hands still in place. I fought the urge to yell at him and took a deep breath, edging out the cold of fear. I never thought. I thought I would die childless. That Lena's children would inherit. "I know you do not want to have a child." Thank you." That last bit was said in such a small voice that I forgot my anger and fear and brought him close, burying my face in the mess his hair had become. We stayed like that for a while until there was a knock on the door, startling us from our thoughts. "Your Grace, we have drawn your bath as you requested." I sighed happily into Laenor's shoulder and moved away, wincing as muscles I was unused to using protested. "I will be out in a moment." I called and I heard the sound of the maid bustling off. As I made my way to the corner and began sorting for something to wear, Laenor snorted and flopped back into the pillows. "May I ask you a question?" he said carefully as I retrieved a nightgown to hide my nakedness. "Is it about Lena?" My voice was tight and he nodded, rearranging the covers around him. "What did you wish to ask?" "Joffrey. Joffrey says you truly desire her." I snorted. "That's not a question." "Besides, she has made herself quite clear," I replied, forcing a mild tone into my voice. "I did not realize she thought me shameful," he said quietly. I sighed and dropped next to him, running my hands through his hair. He blushed. "I also did not realize you truly desired me as a wife desires her husband." "You are very desirable," I told him. His training regime was already doing wonders for him. He'd begun putting on muscle. He'd never been a martial man, not truly. He'd squired with his uncle Lucerys to learn ships and sailing. Add in his dragon, he'd always had a hard time seeing why he should use the sword. But the chance at wielding Dark Sister had lit something within him. Not that he could use the blade yet, of course. The moment I was head of House Targaryen though, I would make sure he would have it then. For now it would remain safely hidden with the Lawnmouths. And if Viserys thought his new hold over me would compel me to reveal that he had another thing coming. But I lay with another man. I love another man. I cannot please you," he sounded anxious. I snorted. "You are a very pretty man with a very fine mind. You please me well enough." I left before the temptation to kiss him got too much. He would try, for my sake he would try, but it would make him uncomfortable in the extreme. I had no right to force that on him. The bath was steaming in the early morning light and I sighed happily as I discarded the nightgown and clambered in. My momentary jealousy that Laenor got to head back to the land of sleep gone as I luxuriated in the warmth. I lowered my head back and closed my eyes, mind beginning to wake up. Last night had been, not all that great. Humiliating jumped to mind. Embarrassing, frustrating and nerve-wracking were also good descriptors. We tried to do it the natural way first, but Laenor had struggled and in the end we'd resorted to using more artificial means to, do the deed. I clutched at the soap and the washcloth and scrubbed myself down with a shudder. It felt like I was in some kind of dream, sometimes. Daemon's flight. I had been so sure it would lead to something, war, assassination, the Game of Thrones in truth. Now here I was bathing in King's Landing and no one was talking about it anymore. The bounty would go out and he would die and nothing would really change. I finished up and met Maria and Alice who helped me dress and kept up an endless stream of chatter. In truth I was glad for it. I could barely keep my thoughts on track and in the present. Without their questions and gossip, my brain might have exited my head entirely. After that I was summoned by my dearest father to break my fast with the rest of the family. Because of course he would pick the day I was feeling as if I might shatter at the slightest touch. Alicent and her brood minus Daeron were already there. I took care to wrap Helena in an extra tight hug. She'd been devastated when she'd been handed back into Alicent's company. Even more so when the queen had tried to forbid her practice with the bow. Helena had apparently thrown a fit so loud and so great that Viserys had overrode Alicent for the first time ever when it came to the children in order to let her continue. Dragon rages. Not even once. Or maybe just spoiled princess rages, as Helena didn't actually have a dragon yet. Like most Targaryen children, they'd been given eggs in the cradle but none had hatched. It had been the subject of some court gossip, but ultimately it had come to nothing, as my own egg had never hatched either. Huh, I hadn't thought about that in years. Where did that get to? If I remember rightly, it had been a pale red, almost pink, shot through with a deeper red. Honestly, it's probably a good idea I didn't end up with that dragon. I wouldn't have been able to resist calling it Raspberry Ripple, and who would follow a dragon called Raspberry Ripple into battle? No, let me see. Malaise. The egg had been from Malaise last clutch when she was ridden by Princess Alyssa. Perhaps Rhaenys had it then. Are you listening to me, Rhaenyra? Viserys' question cut into my daydream about forcing everyone to take Raspberry Ripple very seriously lest they be set aflame. I flushed and mumbled an apology. As I was saying, I have discussed this with Aegon and he has agreed, so I am proud to tell you all he will be squiring for Lord Jason Lannister. Alicent looked especially smug as he smiled nervously at us all. His siblings were decidedly less so. You can't send him away, shouted Helena and Aemond at the same time. Although Helena sent her father a desperate look and Aemond sent me a hateful look. Viserys looked startled. You're only sending him away because Rhaenyra is here. You should send Rhaenyra away again and then Aegon can stay here. Aemond said, small fists balled up in anger and glaring hatefully between Viserys and I. Aemond, my beloved, he is not going away because of Rhaenyra, Alicent cooed, trying to draw him onto her lap. But I want him to stay here, said Helena desperately, small hands finding her mother's arm. Whatever next-level puppy dog eyes Helena was deploying managed to get Alicent pause in genuine emotional pain and halt her attempts to restrain Aemond, who promptly pulled himself free and flung himself at me. He collided with my midsection and proceeded to pummel at my stomach and thighs. He was only 5, but some of those strikes really fucking hurt, okay? Viserys hauled him away and the little boy broke down crying in his father's arms. I hate you, he said, clutching at his father's black sleeves. I sent Viserys a stricken look because there was absolutely nothing I could do or say to that. Through it all Aegon had remained silent and still. Now his eyes were on me, wide with fear, as if he expected retribution to be swift. I hated that. I did not wish to be to him as Daemon had been to me. But Aegon wants to stay here. Helena was wailing with no small amount of distress, completely drowning out Aemond's furious sniffling. Are you happy with going to Casterly Rock? I asked him when Viserys became distracted, calming Helena's wailing. If not, I will petition father on your behalf. He looked bewildered at the offer but shook his head. I don't like it here. I want to go. He said, and my heart broke when he added before thinking about it. People are mean to me. Unfortunately, Alicent and Viserys caught the end of his sulk. I saw her green eyes blaze into fury and flicker to me. Who? I asked. If it is any of mine, I'll have their heads. And I was telling the truth. I'd been very clear that when it came to my blacks, Aegon and the children were off limits. Alicent and her idiot father were fair game, but my siblings were children and deserved a childhood. Alicent had robbed them all of that, but I was damned if I was going to contribute. Aegon just shook his head violently. Other children. Aemond shouts at them. Viserys glanced towards his second son with a pained expression. Do you know who these children are? Asked Alicent with the kind of malice that told me she wasn't above fighting literal children when it came to her kids. I really hope none of those children are associated with me. I don't know their names. I know what colors they wear though. Aemond said brightly and with a worrying amount of vicious glee. Well, you shall tell me after we have broken our fast, and we shall see how mean these children are when I have a word with their fathers. Then she paused and eyed me with something close to grudging respect. Apologize to your sister for striking her. I'm sorry, he said through gritted teeth. Viserys opened his mouth to scold him and I interrupted. It is no issue, Aemond. Anyone would be upset when their brother is leaving. Viserys shut his mouth and gave me a grateful look as Aemond was released back to his chair next to Aegon. Regardless, I do hope you enjoy yourself at Casterly Rock. They say there are rooms there lined with gold. Rooms I will see once I'd produced a baby to barter with. Ugh, Westeros was gross. Food arrived and I decided on my usual chilled fruit. I'd picked up an especial fondness for pear somewhere. It was nice to see someone knew this, as I noted more of the delicious fruit was present than usually warranted. And when you ride a dragon, travel will be EA-. Alicent glared at me and I paused, glancing towards Viserys, who was stuffing his face with food and not paying attention. I turned my attention back and raised an eyebrow in questioning. When will we get dragons? Demanded Aemond. Oh. Oh, that is why she doesn't want me mentioning the D word. Oops. Our eggs didn't hatch, came Aegon's gloomy reply. Mine didn't hatch either, I told him. His eyes flicked up in surprise and I smiled at him. His usual fear was gone, replaced by an almost hesitant excitement. I tamed Syrax at Dragonstone. Oh indeed. I remember that day clearly, daughter. I was beside myself with fear the entire time after we discovered you missing. Emma threatened to have my head if you were harmed, Viserys boomed between mouthfuls of bread and jam. And then you pitched such a fit about leaving her in the dragon pit. I remember you being very insistent that she remain outside of it. He reached over and poured himself some juice before guzzling an entire goblet at once. I watched in a morbid kind of horror as he belched. I could definitely see how the pounds were being piled on. You gave me an entire lecture on why you'd risked a wild dragon over a pit-bred one. I was about to reply that it had hardly gotten me anywhere when Aemond cut in, eyes bright with excitement. There are dragons at the pit now. Dragons we can have. I saw pain flicker across Alicent's features and made an intuitive guess as to how the siblings had become so misinformed about dragons. They will claim them eventually, history tells me that. But perhaps I can give Aegon one last good memory of me before he goes. If you will allow it, father, I believe Aegon and Helena are old enough to claim their own mounts. I can take them today, something to celebrate the news of Aegon's squiring. Viserys' eyes lit up with happiness even as Alicent sent me a look of pure hate. Why can't I claim a dragon? Protested Aemond as we reached the dragon pit. Around us, Alicent's knights were dismounting and preparing themselves for the sweltering heat of the pit proper. Aemond, you are 5. Your mother was very insistent. I told him. Nearby, Helena was speaking to a terrified Aegon in fast and low tones, and it was hard to tell which of them was the 6-year-old and which was the 8. I smiled only to have it wiped from my face when Aemond's shoe bounced off my shin. Helena is only 6, he snarled. I want a dragon. Well, you aren't getting one, I replied in an airy tone. He went to kick my shin again but was promptly lifted into the air by Criston Cole, who'd finally seemed to notice the incoming temper tantrum. Enough, Aemond. Your mother is the ultimate authority when it comes to you all, I said as he tried to wiggle out of Cole's grip. He stilled and glared, sulky expression drifting over his face. You may come with us to see the dragons, but you are forbidden from trying to tame on. Yes, sister. There was a lot of venom there. Also he goes still when lying. Swear it on your honor as a Targaryen. If I had thought his glare heated before, well, let's just say I'm not his favorite sibling ever and leave it at that. I, Aemond Targaryen, do swear that I will only look at the dragons and not try and tame one. Keep an eye on him, Cole. If Alicent will have my head should he get injured, I dread to think what she would do to you. Cole looked as if he wanted to argue. Unfortunately, he knew I was right. So he put up and shut up. I gathered our party together and we entered. Helena led Aegon over and chivied him into taking one of my hands whilst she claimed the other. At first his grip was loose, as if he expected to want to run, but when the first of the dragon's bellowing reached us it clamped tightly around my fingers. I gave both hands a reassuring squeeze. Well met, your grace, rumbled a large, bare-chested man. A few of the true dragon keepers, not the knights, gathered behind him. Well met, Franklin. Might I introduce you to my beloved siblings? Prince Aegon, Princess Helena, and Prince Aemond. Franklin bowed low and a tad floridly than necessary as my siblings sounded off their greetings. Aegon, Helena, Aemond. This man is responsible for the well-being of all the dragons in the pit. Franklin gave me a grin and I returned it. He was not a man given to overly respectful displays or chasing after influence like a starving dog. He knew his business and he knew it well. A king and a peasant are the same to a dragon after all, and spending so much time with the beasts tends to warp one's sense of view. How could you bow to a man when you've seen what Franklin had seen? We followed him through the dragon pit. The air around us became hotter and the knights that had elected to follow us began looking extremely uncomfortable, bar Criston Cole and Byron Hastwick. Shame, it would have been nice to see them squirm a bit. Then my siblings stopped dead as they saw the dragons. My own Syrax was closest, coiled close to the scarlet malaise and Laenor's sea smoke. Interestingly, Vhagar was absent. Of the other dragons I knew by name there was only Dreamfire, the small and slender dragon of Rina Targaryen. I'd seen her only twice before, and despite being the oldest dragon in the pit, she was amongst the smallest if one ignored the hatchlings. She was listless, sleepy, and seemingly carrying the great tragedies her mistress had suffered around with her still. I disliked being near her. It made my heart hurt. "Where is the big one?" asked Aemond, crashing into Aegon's shoulders. I tugged them both back and tried not to think too hard about how Aemond lusted after Vhagar and why. "Lady Lena is the greatest flyer of our generation. She is often astride Vhagar," I told them, and Aemond actually pouted. "I think she's right," Aegon declared, letting go of my hand. "If you have a dragon you should ride it lots." Syrax moved her head to look at us as if to deny that outright. My dragon very much loved her naps and non-strenuous activities like swimming and setting fire to the innocent marine life of Blackwater Bay. Don't ask how. I'm pretty sure water shouldn't burn like that as well. Honestly, anti-pollution measures may need to be instituted once I get the throne. "You've got a few unclaimed hatchlings over there," Franklin told my 2 older siblings. I followed his pointed finger. 5 young dragons coiled together and away from the larger, claimed dragons. Aegon scrambled forward to get a better look at them. "Please don't be my future method of execution. That would really suck." Helena followed him, her eyes wandering over the claimed dragons though. Syrax generously allowed a few nose scritches as she passed. Malaise slumbered on as usual, which honestly didn't surprise me. That dragon had laziness levels that Syrax could only aspire to. Sea Smoke stirred with interest but seemed to calm when he noted neither Malaise or Syrax had responded to any threat. I followed the 2 at a distance, Franklin at my side. Helena paused and turned to look at Dreamfire. She was a pretty dragon. A beautiful blue swirled over with silver. I'd once floated the idea of my mother claiming her. After all, she fit Emma's color scheme perfectly. Mother had laughed it off. She had considered herself an Arryn and was very firm on the idea she did not want a dragon despite her heritage giving her the right to try for one. "The old woman," chuckled Franklin as he noticed Helena's interest. "Dreamfire. A princess rode her once. Do you know the story of Rina Targaryen?" I asked. Helena turned her wide violet eyes to me and nodded solemnly. "Lady Maria told me. She said one of her great-aunts died of sickness serving Princess Rina. That's one way to put Samantha Stokeworth's death. Well navigated, Maria. Gold stars all around." "She died lonely," Lady Maria said. "I don't want to die alone." "What? Morbid thoughts. Where has this come from, little one?" I asked. My sister raised her eyes to me, looking pained, and then she shrugged. I took her hands in mine and bent down to her level. She was chewing her bottom lip in a way that told me she was exceptionally upset about something. Franklin moved away to shadow Aegon and give us some privacy. "I think it's the worst thing in the world to die alone," she whispered. Feeling very much like I only had half the story, I prepared my best big sister speech I could give on the matter at short notice. "Everyone dies alone, Helena. We can't take people or things with us when we go. We just need to live our lives as well as possible so that the 7 may judge us worthy," I murmured. Helena smiled and then brushed away a single tear. "Thank you," she said, and turned her back on slumbering Dreamfire and ran after her brother. What had just happened? Perhaps this was something to mention to Alicent. If she had gotten dying alone from someone else, on second thought, I should probably investigate myself. There will already be hell to pay if it turns out my blacks have been harassing Aegon via child proxy, never mind if they've tried Helena too. I stood up and rejoined Franklin. Aegon had the hatchlings now and was now reaching out to touch one. It was pale in the gloom, although when I truly examined it I could see it was actually the palest blue. The dragon was young, he would not be able to fly for a few more years yet. He wouldn't be confined to the dragon pit as Sunfire presumably was in canon, instead allowed to spend his formative years in Casterly Rock. Would this render him more deadly than the Golden Dragon? Aegon wouldn't have the benefit of a dedicated instructor like I had in Lady Rhaenys. What would this change? Finally, the hatchling uncurled itself from the defensive ball it had assumed and sniffed curiously at him before making a high-pitched sound that was crossed between a gargle and shriek and moving its head further into Aegon's palm. I let out an explosive breath of relief. "Behind the horns, brother, the soft skin," I called, and his hand sought it out. A moment later he let out the strange gargling noise one more and stretched his neck out as far as it would go, eyes closed in pleasure. Aegon's face lit up with a smile I rarely saw. Across from him, Helena was approaching a mottled green hatchling that wouldn't have looked out of place in the neck. It barely came up to her knee, but I was well aware of what even a small dragon could do to a child. I tensed without meaning to. But I needn't have worried. This one did not even show the slightest hesitation as it curled forward, brushing up against her dresses. "You did it, Hela," cheered Aegon, startling both the hatchlings. I chuckled, I couldn't help it. Baby dragons were kind of dopey looking, even more so when startled. "Now you need to name them," I pointed out as Franklin bustled off unobtrusively to inform the knights of my siblings' success in claiming their dragons. They examined their dragons thoughtfully. "Frost," Aegon pronounced happily a moment later. I forced a smile onto my face. He was 8, I hadn't exactly been expecting him to bust out the Valriant, but still, Frost. Then again, his first dragon had been called Sunfire. A beautiful name for a beautiful dragon. He puffed up at the praise before he went back to staring at the hatchling. I chuckled at the look of awe on his face and turned to Helena. "You named Syrax for a Valyrian goddess?" she asked eventually. "Yes, I did. Technically anyway. Syrax, the Valyrian goddess of victory. A painfully ironic name in retrospect. Then again, Rhaenyra had got her victory in the end. She'd died for it, but Aegon's line had ended with him. All future Targaryens were descended from her. I examined the hatchling as it examined its new rider in turn. It wasn't going to win any Dragon Beauty Awards, but I could tell that did not matter to Helena. She ran her fingers across the dragon's snout, eyebrows furrowed in thought before it cleared, and she smiled to herself. "Morgul," she said finally. "I shall name her Morgul." In another time, a time that would not come to pass, a doomed daughter of Helena Targaryen had named her own dragon that. And now I had the necessary knowledge to give context to such a name. Morgul, the Valyrian goddess of death. I shivered despite the heat, but Helena did not notice, too enraptured with her new dragon. I shook off the morbidity. Helena would not throw herself from a window, mad with grief, and should she ever birth a daughter, I would make sure she lived a long and happy life. "Come, your brother will be excited to see your new dragons." They followed obediently, comparing their dragons to the others in excited tones. When Aemon saw us, he wriggled free of Cole and charged over. The three promptly folded into a small celebration of all things dragon. I stood to the side where both groups were visible. Cole's expression was quite unreadable, but I warrant there was some relief there. Had the queen lost even one child today, she would have him killed slowly as an opener to her rage. "Can we show mother and father?" asked Helena. I looked at the two hatchlings, each barely coming up to their new owner's waists, and tried to formulate a way to let them down gently. "Perhaps," I glanced towards Aegon, who blushed and then took a deep breath. "Perhaps you could take us on Syrax and the dragons could follow." That was pretty brave of him actually. I smiled, and my smile was actually and honestly genuine as I nodded. Helena cheered, and even Aemon looked thrilled at the prospect of a dragon ride. After all, only Helena had ever ridden a dragon amongst the three, and even then it was only once or twice on Syrax's back. Syrax gave me a pained look at the thought of 3 excited children clambering all over her, but she could suck it up. Being clambered on now may save her a fight in the future. Franklin was fast at saddling her, at least, even if I did require extra straps to stop anyone falling to their deaths. After they were all strapped in securely and Criston Cole had gotten over his 3rd heart attack, I urged Syrax forward. I took us up first, laying out all of King's Landing below us. I could hear Aegon laughing pure delight, and I couldn't help but grin myself. Morgul and Frost followed, and when Syrax let out bellowing roar, they let loose their own, slightly less impressive, echoes. I twirled my siblings around the city a few times before landing in the courtyard of the Red Keep, near the crowd that had assembled by a visibly pacing figure I could only assume was Alicent and the waving blob I was labeling Viserys. Syrax landed gracefully, something I was glad for. I was less glad when Aegon immediately tried to hurl himself from the saddle in excitement whilst still being chained to me. Still, I got them free eventually. I suspect Alicent was too relieved to see all her children alive and not on fire to summon the will to be angry at the unsanctioned dragon ride. "Father. I do believe Helena and Aegon have something to show you," I called as I freed Aemond and handed him to his mother. Frost and Morgul landed, and the crowd that had formed oohed and awed in appreciation. Viserys split into a wide grin at the sight, and Alicent even managed a small smile, looking faint with relief. "Your children are dragons," I thought at her as she met my eyes. "Now see the proof." Frost and Morgul were the talk of the Red Keep over the next few days, and my siblings soaked up the attention like flowers facing the sun. The only worrying note was Eamon loudly telling his mother he hadn't wanted a dragon from the pit anyway because they were small and he wanted a big one like Vagr. The way his eyes lit up when he said that name sent chills down my spine. The urge to get Lena her own dedicated team of bodyguards is rising. Not that she'd consider curbing her own flying habits. Apparently, she'd decided to begin a secret project of her own, hence the trips she'd been taking to and from Dragonstone. And speaking of my erstwhile Valerian allies. Are you sure about Alicent's plan for Helena and Aegon? Asked Corlys. I'd retreated to the Valerian manse after the preparations for Aegon's going-away feast had become too tiresome and Alicent too overbearing. At least Rhaenys had stopped looking at me like I was personally responsible for both her children's proclivities. With the way she had been acting, anyone would think she thought it a communicable disease and she the next in line to catch it. At least Lena hadn't told her of my desire in turn. I'm pretty sure. She may be uncomfortable around dragons at the moment, but she worships the ground Jaehaerys once walked on. She'll want the associations with him and Alysanne for Helena and Aegon, I told the assembled group. I understand why you believe this, Rhaenyra, but you have, subverted Helena. Will she risk giving Aegon a disloyal queen? Joffrey asked. Damn, that was a good point. The young Stormlander had his leg stretched out in front of the fire. Laenor was massaging it, flinching every time Joffrey grimaced in pain. This squiring business sounds like code for introducing the young couple and seeing if a match can be made, Rhaenys said, eyes on the beautiful Myrish rug Corlys had decorated the room with. Her husband nodded along with her in agreement. And the Lannisters are rich. It gives her the advantage when it comes to bribes now, grunted Corlys after quiet reflection. With her allies in the west, she has literal gold mine to bring to bear. I chewed my lip. Had I butterflied the marriage away, or was this a play by Alicent? Make me focus on the Lannisters and try to what? Speaking of deep pockets, Corlys continued. What in the seven hells are you two spending 20,000 dragons on at Dragonstone? Gold statues of yourselves. I winced. That was a lot of money, and that was just the Valerian contribution. Corlys had become increasingly overbearing about money recently. Viserys' grant to rebuild Spicetown may have ensured the town would be rebuilt, but he was losing a king's ransom in gold in the meantime. My defense came from a very surprising corner. Father, I've seen what the Wisdoms are working on. Techniques for more food, and they are close to making clear glass reliably, Lena said. Corlys raised an eyebrow at her and she flushed. And also the new midwives, and Maester Gerardis says he has a secret project in the works that will change how everyone diagnoses illness in Westeros. Midwives are for the small folk, Rhaenys cut in. She wasn't taking Joffrey's, actually my, insistence that Lena employ one very well, but Lena's midwife had forgotten more about delivering babies safely than most maesters had ever known in the first place. And she came equipped with forceps, the ability to read and write, and Gerardis lessons in biology and emergency care. Try and die on her watch, Lena, it isn't happening. These aren't some hedge witches selling potions for a copper at the village market, I said, tartly. They're trained by my own Maester Gerardis to the standards of any maester. They have the latest techniques and technologies. Plus, they have experience, something most maesters lack. And what's the point in having them? The small folk love you since you've unleashed them on Dragonstone, Driftmark, and King's Landing, but I hardly see the lords of the kingdoms clamoring for their services when they all pay for their perfectly sufficient maesters, Rhaenys snorted. Well, after the heir to the Iron Throne and her beloved good sister employs their services, I'm sure more than few lords will be interested, I said. And from then on it's a simple matter of watching the lords connect the dots as to who has the more living wives and children. And these new midwives will be trained at Dragonstone, bought from Dragonstone and loyal to Dragonstone, I suppose, asked Rhaenys, accepting a glass of wine from Corlys. I shrugged, she already knew the answer. Well, if they keep my girl well with these constant visits like the one today, I'll grant they might be useful. I trust you can justify the other experiments. Glass for instance. You'll hardly beat the Myrish. Before I could answer Corlys, Laenor spoke up. We don't need to. We just need it to do the job it needs to, and the much lower price we can sell for will do the rest. We're closer to the Westerosi and Braavosi markets, he enthused. And Rhaenyra has agreed to set up the initial glassworks on Driftmark under Valerian control. That is very kind of you, your grace, said Corlys, struggling to keep the look of greedy glee of his face as he mentally counted the likely profits. Wait until you hear about the Siu dash. A knock at the door spared Corlys the lecture his son was about begin and a young maid stepped inside, curtsying low. My lords, there is a lady called Alanis asking to see Lady Lina. Lina sat up straight at that and dropped a hand to the swell of her stomach. Yes, yes. Show her to my rooms, I will join her in a moment. I watched as she stood up before deciding to be spontaneous. Lina blinked in surprise as I stood to follow her. You do not mind? I am. Laner and I have begun trying, I explained, ignoring how Rhaenys' face lit up and Corlys looked so self-satisfied I wanted to slap him on principle. Oh. I suppose. Was it weird? I bet she thought I was being weird. Yes, very well. Alanis was an older woman, tall and spare with red hair fading towards gray. I liked her, she had a naturally friendly face lined with evidence of a life spent laughing. I suppose putting women at ease was a good skill to have her line of work. I was ushered into a corner whilst Alanis helped Lina into a white gown for ease of access but also to cover her modesty. Although I did catch sight of her uncovered stomach, a dark line disappearing into her small clothes and angry red stretch marks across her pale skin. Even pregnant the sight set my heart racing and I had to remind myself not to be a complete creep. Then she was covered and laid back on the bed and I got to see my first antenatal exam in Westeros. Designed by Gerardis and his coterie of midwives using techniques I'd introduced. You know, despite his protests to the contrary, I think he's fond of the group of women he'd gathered. Have you been eating the recommended foods? Alanis asked as her hands brushed over the swell of Lina's belly. I could just make out her nodding, silver hair brushing over the white pillows. That's the leafy dark vegetables, fish and eggs, your grace. Is there any chance of twins? I asked, after a few moments of watching Alanis poke and prod. The woman glanced up with a raised eyebrow at the randomness of the question before meeting Lina's eyes. I doubt it. She would have shown far earlier and been a lot bigger, Alanis mused. Do you have a family history of twins? Well, we've had a few. Not recently, Lina replied, looking unaccountably relieved. Damn, I had hoped for Bela and Rina, second and third best Targaryens after Rhaenys in the original timeline and I will physically fight anyone who says otherwise. How is the baby moving? She asked as she moved across to the bag she had bought out one of Gerardis' prized stethoscopes. With care, and ignoring Lina's startled squeak at the cold, she laid it against the bump and listened intently before humming in thought. He is, excitable. Lina's hands clenched in the sheets and I tried not to smile at her wording. By all accounts her baby was quite the active one. Not that I'd ever felt the babe move. Lina had never invited me to and it seemed like the height of folly to push the point. I tried to not to feel hurt, to take offense, but it was hard. That is good. Your babe was slow to quicken, strong movements now are a good sign. Alanis told us, moving away to return the stethoscope to its place in the bag. Although it is hard to hear his heartbeat today. If he is already uncooperative I dread to see his teenage years, I told her with a strange chuckle and she just sighed. Alanis returned and tapped at her legs slightly before giving me a meaningful look. I need to do a pelvic examination. Oh. I certainly did need to be present for that. I went to rise but Lina stopped me, surprisingly. Stay. I was hoping we could walk in the gardens afterwards. I gave in to those pleading violet eyes and took the outstretched hand, feeling like 14-year-old Rhaenyra again. I must admit I don't normally have an audience, Alanis said as Lina raised her legs. The gown preserved her modesty well enough, all I could see was the silhouette of her knees. I am trying for a child myself. I wanted to see what Gerardis had come up with firsthand. She chuckled at that. Well, I wish you all the luck, your grace. We midwives know who we have the backing of and any one of us would be honored to assist with your pregnancy. That was strangely touching. Wrong choice of words considering where she currently had her hands, maybe. Lina jumped and let out a hiss of discomfort. Her hand tightened its grip on mine as she jumped again. Then she screwed her eyes shut tightly and set her mouth into a grimace, whole body tense. Her hand tightened on mine almost painfully and I gave it a reassuring squeeze. Please keep breathing, my lady. You'll make it harder if you tense up. I rubbed my thumb in soothing circles across her hand as Lina began breathing again, breath hitching every so often. Nearly over, my lady. Thank the seven, she mumbled and then squeaked in surprise at something as Alanis finished up. Excellent, my lady. Certainly no problems there. Alanis departed with little fanfare after that and a few more basic questions about Lina's diet. I found I very much appreciated her bedside manner as well as her friendly demeanor. No nonsense but not a complete arse about it. I made a mental note to ask Joffrey to assign her to me if Laenor and I's adventures in DIY IVF ever got off the ground. Oh gods, I can't even decide if I really hope it does or doesn't. After she had gotten dressed and cleaned up, I followed her to the garden of the manse. We walked for a while, side by side in silence. "How are your attempts with my brother going?" she asked quietly, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Well. Fine." She pursed her lips then. "They are certainly happening." "You do not sound happy," she pointed out, resting a hand on her own stomach. I had thought you waited because of Laenor." The strangled, high-pitched and hastily cut off laugh she received from me in turn earned me a very odd look. No, I very much did not. I am afraid," I admitted. "I do not want to be some broodmare, spitting out children on command. I do not want to ruin my looks, my health. It will hurt, I could die." "Oh," she said, staring determinedly at a bright flower. "I did not know. I am sorry. Think nothing of it." I hardly went around telling people. More awkward silence as we took our seats on a bench and watched a bee make its way through the flowers. It was still warm in King's Landing. Melas said that autumn was coming according to the maesters, but I could see why southerners didn't much fear the seasons. "I can resign as your lady, if you wish," Lena said finally, eyes still on the bee. I stared at her in horror. "Why?" "If I have made you uncalm dash," she cut me off as she turned to look at me, eyebrow raised. I flushed. "We have been distant. Very distant. I thought perhaps you would happier with my child and I further away." My eyes flickered to her enlarged stomach, her hand resting over it protectively. Did she think me a monster? One who would kill a child for the sins of its father? "Your child has nothing to fear from me," I said, tone frosty. She was still tense though, still watching me as if I might lash out. "You have never been rational when confronted with evidence of that man," she pointed out, her tone made of steel. "He is not just a child of that man. He is yours and Joffrey's," I began. She opened her mouth to respond but I kept going. "That man will have nothing to do with the child and I am offended you think that I would harm a child for his father's sins. What do you think I am? Completely bereft of morality. You accuse me of being a whore and a kinslayer, what next?" She closed her mouth as I finished, looking taken back. I did not mean it that way," she finally said. I scowled at her careful tone, like she was the one walking on eggshells and I the one exploding for no good reason. "I merely meant dash. That I am petty, vain, arrogant, proud and angry." She winced and I rose to my feet. "Resign if you want. I would not wish to bind you in service when you so obviously do not wish to be here." She caught my hand. "Wait, damn your temper. Wait." I stopped and looked back as she struggled from the seat. "I did not mean any of this. I just did not wish for you to be uncomfortable. We were friends once, Rhaenyra, I want to be again. I care for you." "You have a funny way of showing it," I mumbled as she took my other hand. She snorted. "I did not mean to imply you were a whore or a kinslayer. I did not. And I came to like you knowing your faults, Rhaenyra." She brought my hands up and laid them across her stomach. Beneath her skin my cousin, and wasn't that a strange thought, kicked away. "Let us be close again. I miss my friend." All right. Friends. Aegon had changed since he'd tamed Frost and the change was so radical it was obvious. Instead of sulking and cowering he beamed in pride as lord after lord came before the high table to congratulate him on taming his dragon and on his squiring with the Lannisters. It was amusing to watch Alicent preen over how regal her son was being only to remember that it was due to my actions and upset herself 5 minutes later. She'd been even more upset to learn none of my blacks had children amongst the little terrors that had been picking on my dearest younger brother. Mostly war hawks, a few doves and most surprisingly a green lord who was currently on his way home. Honestly, if Aegon were not already promised to Casterly Rock, she would have to send him away after that. The optics of her chosen candidate hiding in his mother's skirts whilst she unleashed hell on mere children were damaging the green cause more than anything I could do. Still, he was going away. He would be gone from court for many years until he was knighted. We'd be lucky to see him here in King's Landing once or twice a year when something especially grand happened or whichever Lannister he was given to came by for business. I was startled to find myself worrying about him. It was hard to resent him when he thanked me for the 5th time for helping him get frost, or showed such outward love for the gifts I'd gotten him that one would be forgiven for thinking they were the only gift he'd received. Apparently, he really liked the various materials on dragons I'd forced Lina to hand over. Honestly, I had no clue why she had brought those to King's Landing, but I was not about to look a gift horse in the mouth. Despite all the progress I'd made with Aegon, it was still galling to see Alicent's greens returning to prominence as Viserys grew lax in his annoyance. I do not know what took place between them after I was sent away, but with my return it had healed. Or perhaps he assumed that with Aegon's fostering the green presence would naturally die away as their chosen candidate was no longer within the city. That his taking his family in hand would end the two factions sooner rather than later. Or maybe I was just grouchy. Lord Gerald was leaving, and given I had annoyed Jane recently, I had no clue who she'd send to take his place. "You seem discomfited, Rhaenyra," came Alicent's false concern, and I gritted my teeth before directing a smile her way. "Merely thinking, my queen." A habit you still haven't broken, I see," she said, pleasant smile at odds with her disapproving tone. I became aware of a lot of eyes on us and plastered my own smile into place. "Whatever do you mean by that?" "Thinking?" I asked, and she snorted, taking a sip of her drink. "No. The habit of going off into your own head. You spent Queen Emma's entire lecture after your taming of Syrax looking as you were somewhere else entirely. I honestly had not expected her to remember that. It had been 12 years ago after all. And you barely acknowledged the prince's praise. Ouch. Still bitter. I think we've established what Daemon's praise is worth by now, still no one had claimed his bounty. I think we had all expected every rogue on the island to turn on him the instant it was announced, but it had only been a week. There was plenty of time for a knife to find his heart or guts yet." She snorted and then rose. "Join me for a walk in the courtyard?" The eyes of the court, and Viserys, were on our backs. We left. Criston went to follow, but a small wave from Alicent saw him fall back. I hope Viserys had seen that. It would get him thinking even further about where Cole's loyalties were. When we were outside in the night's air and we both had assured ourselves of privacy, she turned to me with a look of rage. "Why is the whore not dead yet?" she growled, and I didn't need to a mind reader to know who she was referring to. "I'm not quite sure what you mean." That did not mean I was going to play ball and throw Lina under the proverbial bus. Alicent would eat her alive. She snarled and then turned away, pacing back and forth. "You cannot fool me as easily as you can fool Viserys. The babe is his, I know it and you know it. Now why is the whore and the bastard still alive?" she all but shouted into the night. So Viserys had not told her. My begging must have worked. Then again, he was hardly going to hand his stick to Alicent now he'd finally found it. I took a deep breath to reply, but she wasn't done. "We had an agreement, Rhaenyra. Why have you not secured your father's agreement to burn those islands?" "Because to do so is suicide. You think if 4 dragons turned up to fight him I wouldn't be his first target? And Lina carries Joffrey's babe, not Daemon's. Even Viserys knows that." I spat. "You always say you will aid me in fighting him and you always betray me," she hissed right back. I knew what she was on about before she'd reached the end of her sentence. "You and I both know Viserys wanted that betrothal, that it was always going to happen. You saw an excuse and took it," I replied, trying to keep my voice low. Alicent stared at me. "Do you think that I would still call Lina a friend, still protect her, if she knew he'd maimed me and bedded him anyway? Technically true is the best kind of true, remember?" The question took the wind out of Alicent's sails and she actually seemed to be thinking that over. "I do not trust her. I do not trust him around pretty young women." Annoying but expected. Alicent had been very in love with Daemon, once upon a time. She'd have sacrificed her chance at having Viserys for a chance at Daemon. He'd first met her when she'd been 13, the new hand's daughter, fresh to court. He'd watched her grow, flirted and seduced her and then finally bedded her just 2 years later. It was disgusting. I'd whined and wheedled and generally been a little shit, but Alicent had been in love. She certainly wasn't going to listen to a 6-year-old's opinion. It had taken a year to go bad, but the first signs of problems came almost immediately after Daemon left his first post as Master of Coin. Then he'd left his post as Master of Laws. Both resignations because he was bored. Viserys had given him commander of the guard then, and he had forged his gold cloaks. I would have to purge them in time because the gold cloaks had been made in Daemon's image. They were greedy, corrupt and hedonistic. Canon knowledge tells me they'll never improve, and canon knowledge tells me that if he snaps his fingers, half of them will likely run to his side. I cannot afford that if I ever do have to strike at him. Damon's drinking and whoring and association with Lady Miseria had gotten back to her eventually. She'd done what any spoiled child would do when threatened by a woman they have power over. She'd sent her father's men to kill her. Their corpses had been delivered to the Red Keep the next morning, a grim tableau of stab wounds and desecration. Damon had mocked Otto in open court for it, and his relationship with the Hand's daughter had ended there and then. And now he had given her every reason she ever needed to carry out her revenge. As angry as Corlys was, I would warrant Alicent had still managed to send more assassins than him. Alicent, the child is Joffrey's. I care little as to your opinion on him though. I am returning to the feast before father sends a search party. Wait. I paused and glanced back. I watched as she worked her jaw in a fury before giving in to whatever argument she'd been having in her head. I did not thank you for helping the children. Aegon and Helena are much happier. Aegon is improved, and Helena does not seem to have as many nightmares now. Did you ever find out what she dreamed about? She would not tell me. It was curiosity that drove me to ask rather than concern. She would not tell me either. She told Aegon she dreamed of fire and dragons warring though. I felt my stomach drop, and it was sheer practice that kept my smile in place as we made our way back inside. Alicent made her way back to Viserys' side and dropped a small kiss to his temple as she sat down. I made my way back to my seat beside Laenor and dropped into it, feeling like the queen of all idiots. Dragon dreams. Did the Targaryens not see themselves as dragons in their dreams? I glanced around the room, eyes seeking Helena. She was at Aegon's side and happily chatting away to him and his gaggle of friends. As if feeling my gaze, she looked up and met my eyes, smile brightening before noticing my aghast expression. Then she looked downcast and wriggled her way free of the press of children to approach me. She was almost hesitant and afraid, so I did the first thing that came to mind. I opened my arms for a hug, and she hit my shoulder a few moments later, clutching at the shawl I was wearing with a fierce grip. I ran my hand through her hair and rocked her back and forth. Why did you not tell me? I murmured. It hurts. If I tell people they change things and it hurts, she whispered back, and I could feel her tears on my bare shoulders. Next to me, clearly able to hear us, Laenor looked startled before forcing an indulgent look onto his face, as if this were nothing more than normal sisterly bonding. I love that man sometimes. Please don't ask. Please. It hurts and it makes them worse. You told Aegon something, didn't you? Can you tell me what you told him? She tensed and drew back, mouth set into an unhappy curl. 2 dragons, black and green, and they fought. And everything burned. They both died and turned to stone, and afterward all the dragons turned to stone. And he thought that was, she nodded, miserably. He said Mother had already told him you would kill him. That my dream just made it real. He was so scared, and afterward the dreams changed. And they hurt. I pulled her close again. Laenor gave me an aghast look but clearly did not know what to say. He'd thought me to have dragon dreams once upon a time. I suspect learning a child of Viserys truly did have them. My eyes met his again. Nobody can learn of this. Not even Joffrey, I said in a low voice. He looked like he wanted to argue, but then cast another glance at Helena, and then his face softened. Joffrey would want to use her, and Helena was eager enough to please. I did not want to hurt her for garbled look into the future. You have my word. She extracted herself from my shoulder and wiped at her eyes. I noted Viserys' gaze and shrugged at him. He looked unhappy but left me to it. Likely he just attributed it to a childish argument and Helena running to her big sister for comfort. Is this where all the talk of dying alone came from? I asked in a low tone. She nodded. I used to see my death. I was so alone. I was older and I had children, but they died. And Aegon was dead. And you were. Mother wanted to crown me instead of your daughter. I didn't want to betray you. You're the only one who never turns on me, she whispered, and my heart hurt for a child forced to see her own death. Not her canon death though. This sounded far, far worse. I took poison. Laenor gave me an aggrieved look. One I returned easily. No child should have to see that, to know that. It's better now though. I stopped it. It hurt, but I stopped it. She raised her eyes to me and I wanted to hold her again. They shone in determination I'd rarely seen from anyone before. I chose Morgul. Not Dreamfire. I have Dreamfire in those dreams. If I have Morgul, they can't come true. 7 hells, breathed Laner, looking as if he could go punch a dream he absolutely would. Maybe it was because we both had babies on the brain but, well, we were feeling protective. I worried at my lip. Had Helena known in canon? Had that girl walked on through her life eating to numb the pain of what she knew was coming? Helena curled closer to me, pressing her face into my shoulder and brought my arms around her once more. I only realized was weeping when Laner brushed the tears away with a sad smile. I woke that night whilst the moon was still high in the sky to cramps and blood. It set me weeping in loss, even though I had no clue why. I hadn't wanted a baby, I still didn't want a baby. Why was I so upset that it hadn't succeeded? Why did I worry I might never succeed? If people could do it by accident, why couldn't I do it on purpose? Laner and I lay together in bed for a long time afterward. He held me close as I sobbed into his chest and murmured reassurances into my ear. I could tell he was unhappy too. He had been so full of hope. He wanted a child. Now that the possibility had been placed before him, one of his own, he wanted them desperately. He'd brought that damn sword with him to King's Landing. The wooden one we'd played with as children, ready to bequeath it to firstborn whether that be daughter or son. He'd whispered as such into my ear as we'd worked to create one. I don't think he'd dared hope until that first night. I think he still thought there a trick somewhere. He understood though. He told me that it did not matter, that we had so much time. So why did I feel like failure? Why did I feel like I wasn't enough? Why am I crying when I don't want this? A knock on the door broke us out of our despair sometime in the mid-morning, and before I could give in to the urge to scream at whoever it was to leave, the door was opened and Lena slipped in. I wanted to cry again at the reminder her swollen belly gave me but instead settled for burrowing into the pillows and trying to control my tears. Laner's hand rested on my back as he addressed his sister's concerns about the fact neither of us had risen yet. She began her monthly bleedings. Oh. I see. Would you like me to tell Sarah we aren't needed? Staying in bed all day was a bad idea, so I raised my head and sighed heavily in defeat. To stay and weep in loss would see me facing more rumors than I could shake a stick at. Too emotional to rule, too weepy to rule. I couldn't handle Sarah at the moment though. I just couldn't. She would joke and try to cheer me and I did not want to be cheered. In truth I did even want the constant reminder of Lena, but she would be silent about the matter. Tell Sarah to leave. Do not tell her why. I'll probably need your help to get my bloody dress on. Exceptionally poor choice of words there me, well done. My internal voice was bitter and mocking and I hated how dramatic I was being about it all, hated that it hurt this much. On my own. At my look of annoyance that I threw over my shoulder she just frowned. Very well, I'll attend to her grace most diligently. As long as she doesn't mind looking like she was dragged through a hedge backwards. I charitably ignored that and clambered free of the bed as Laner did the same opposite me. He began throwing on his clothes in such a haphazard manner that I wanted to wince and go and correct them. Which wouldn't do much good. He had grooms that would help him dress into fresh clothes when he reached his own rooms, and the so-called walk of shame was anything but. Once I'd gotten through the ordeal of dressing with Lena and her miraculous ability to tie her own fingers together whilst lacing dresses, I retrieved my correspondence and settled down to read through it. Jane was still adamantly ignoring all mentions of marriage, simply acting as if I had not mentioned it at all. I could read the annoyance in her other words though. The way she refused to tell me who she was sending to King's Landing in Lord Gerald's stead, and the way she threw Jessamyn's name into every available sentence she could. That and she was sending Maris back, apparently. Maybe I should have Felena search her for Aaron-sponsored knives. Dragonstone spoke of the increased excitement for the crops and the prototype seaweed farms using ropes and small-scale flooding. It was grounding. I found myself growing invested once again, mind moving from pregnancy and the lack of it as I read about the seaweed farms. Jarrett loved his job and often went into vast amounts of detail when a breakthrough was made. Sadly, they still hadn't discovered the true nature of the purple crystals. I made a mental note for Joffrey to find a sufficiently tractable wisdom to give them a shove in the right direction. Iodine and penicillin, well, it would certainly revolutionize Westerosi medicine. I made another mental note to see if the Maester Gerardis had seen any look in locating some of those old First Men ointment recipes. Still, the letters only took up part of my day and I was soon sat behind my desk with little to do for my day-to-day tasks. I did not want to go to court, to feel small under all of their stares today. So I decided to look into a matter I'd been playing with ideas for since I'd set my heart on the throne. Symbols. Curious things. In Westeros, of course, they were sacrosanct. So much so that the Targaryens taking their own house colors and words brought many who otherwise would have resisted to their banner to their side during the conquest. The idea of the dragons had kept the Targaryens in power long after they'd died out through its sheer legend and mystery. It had kept the Starks in power in the face of the Red Kings, and it kept ensuring said Red Kings would return until their or the Stark line was ended. It was what gave the Gardenas so much control over the Reach and ensured the Tyrells would be centuries out on achieving such control, if they ever could. Lack of a decent symbol was the reason the Tullys barely held the Riverlands every time there was a war, and why Artys Arryn had associated himself with a first-man hero despite being very proud of his Undull heritage. I needed to capitalize on that. Create my own version of England's St. George, so to speak. Which meant a trip to the Red Keep's impressive library to research myths and legends. I could use Aegon to be fair. Or even Rhaenys. Visenya if I was feeling cheeky. Hell, Jaehaerys was a contender despite being king in living memory, but they were Targaryen. I wanted something more in line with the Winged Knight. Something that was here before us that we could point to. Let no one try and convince you I just wanted to read about myths and legends George hadn't gotten round to putting to paper, because it would be a filthy lie. Any reports that I spent a good few hours absorbed in dusty books written by maesters long dead about legends completely unhelpful to my cause are completely unfounded. The unfortunate truth was all that I could find regarding dragons, knights, and anything helpful was Serwyn of the Mirror Shield. The man who'd slain the dragon Uryx, so subtly named for the Valyrian god of destruction. I returned the last book that promised to hold anything helpful to one of Melas' helpers and went wondering about the shelves. In Runsider's time this had been his ultimate domain, and I'd quite frequently gotten myself banned. Never for long on Queen Emma's watch, she had delighted in our shared love of books. Now Melas was in charge, he was a lot less careful about what went where. If Runsider were not already dead, he'd have a heart attack at the dust and haphazard stacking of the books with complete disregard to the system he had painstakingly mapped out over the years he'd spent as Grand Maester. I hadn't read for the sheer joy of it since before I discovered my black powder did not work. Perhaps I should go back to doing so. Perhaps I should follow Emma Arryn's example and read to my children every night. No. Can't think about that. I followed the shelves round to the section on geography, listlessly flicking through treatises on Gisker, the Dothraki, and Bravos. None of which should be next one another on the shelf. There were even a few books about ETI, I noted. Laenor might enjoy them. Perhaps they might even have something new in them that he had not known before. It was adorable how he lit up when the topic was mentioned. Almost like he lit up when High Tide was mentioned. Or, the book. When he stepped away from his mask as the perfect prince consort and became just Laenor, absolute dork. He'd make a good dad. Better than Viserys and Corlys combined. Damn it, brain. I scooped up a fair few and made my way towards the exit with my prizes, only to run head first nearly into Lord Jasper Wilde. He bowed politely, but it was clear he'd rather not be here, or acknowledging I held any kind of power over him as the heir. My lord, how does the day find you? I asked from behind my stack, summoning a pleasant smile. Well enough, your grace. I am hard at work on the Harlesbury case for your father, he said, eyes flickering towards the books as if praying for an escape. The Harlesbury case was an annoyance I could do without. It all came down to wills and how much power they should have. I knew Alicent was behind this getting shunted up to Viserys. By all rights the Tullys should have made a ruling. Even Daemon's ongoing inability to die wouldn't stop her capitalizing on things. Truly a complicated case. I do not envy your search, my lord. He pursed his lips. Well, some tasks are more complicated than others. I still believe it should be the nephews, truthfully. Not the bastard daughter whom Harlesbury had trained to be his heir. And the will of late Sir Harlesbury counts for nothing? Even though the nephew is a drunkard and a wastrel. Jasper scowled at that. I believe the law should be followed in regards to all such cases. Bold. Very bold. Let's do this. Which law would that be? Undull law. You and I both know that Undull law is not the only law, even if it were a well-defined system. There is that of the first men to start, that one is even more ill-defined. When Jasper hesitated, I decided to bait him further. And, of course, there is the Iron Throne. The law regarding the Iron Throne is, of course, different to that of the accepted Undull succession law, he said slowly, stressing the word accepted. It must frustrate him that for all succession was supposed to be clear there were so many incidents of it not being, that it was no small surprise Renly had gone for the throne in canon. It was a mess. A mess I would have to deal with as queen. Regarding the Iron Throne though, my side argued that the succession law was that of the nominated heir regardless of gender, and the Greens argued it was a male-only title following primogeniture. Both arguments have some grounding in precedent. Mine and Valyrian law, in which each house had a designated heir that was nominated by the current head of house. This heir could be any male or female member that bore the family name and possessed a dragon. Even the tiny amount of literature Enar had managed to bring over with him is littered with female heads of house, men choosing their brothers or an especially talented cousin. So it's simple, right? Surely we can just take that concept and copy and paste it across to Westeros. Well, actually no. Because the Lords Freeholder didn't actually own land in the way Westerosi lords did, they didn't have vassals in the way Westerosi lords did, and most importantly there were 40 families of the Lords Freeholder. Each of which had their own dragons and each of which had a vested interest in preventing open rebellion from non-heirs in other families. There were also the Valyrian concepts of disinheritance, elected governance, cadet branches, academia, religion and legitimization, which massively differ to how Westerosi understand those concepts. Okay, I thoroughly admit I'm getting off track here. The point is, the Valyrian inheritance system is always going to be a bitch to get working in Westeros. It will need adjusting and tweaking, but it's a good foundation and miles better than me dying in dragon flame. Their chosen form of succession, on the other hand, had its roots in first man law. Not that a whole bunch of those very, very undull lords wanted to admit it. Instead they argued that the Council of 101 had set a precedent to bar female inheritors. Which unfortunately for them danced very, very close to treason by insisting that a king could not set his own laws if a group of lords had already made decision. There's also another very good reason that they probably don't want to admit it's first man law, and that's because the woman who loses out on inheriting is supposed to be looked after by the male it favored. With some of the examples in the past this mostly works out to marriage, i.e. Balon technically should have married Rhaenys, which would have been possible because under first man law a female claimant wouldn't be married until after it had passed to the male claimant. First men were smart about their marriages and keeping their claims together, I'll give them that. I hate law. I just hate it. It's a mess of customs and common law, and whilst Jaehaerys may have decreed it be the same everywhere, he'd hardly put the work into getting rid of some of the more extraneous and complicated bits. Regardless, the whole thing was a mess, and someone as clever as Jasper Wilde knew that well. Baiting him so was purely for fun though. I knew damn well I had no hope in all 7 hells of bringing him to my side. Well, that is a matter for the king, I said, waving my hand and sending up a wave of dust. Indeed. We all await the day that King Viserys makes a ruling on the actual laws of succession surrounding the Iron Throne. Touché. The fact that Viserys had not done so was a pain in everyone's arse, to be honest. I left him the library in peace after that, having made my point and gotten a bit of pettiness and spite out of my system. My rooms were empty, likely Lena and Sarah's misadventures this morning had reached my lady's ears, and they were hoping that by not being in my direct line of sight they would avoid my eventual raging. I want to say I'm not that bad, but, well, Joffrey had to tell me off for doing precisely that, so I doubt I had a leg to stand on really. Petty, vain, arrogant, angry, and proud echoed in my mind, and I fought a scowl. I stashed the books in my desk to give to Laenor and dropped onto my couch and just allowed myself to enjoy the peace and quiet. The library may have taken up a good few hours, but I hadn't actually got anything done beyond confirm that Westeros had very few legends about dragons. My body ached and I decided I'd at least touched base with Jasper, even if it had been to needle him, so maybe a nap would not be an issue. Sleep claimed me quickly after that. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.